I'm going to try to give you my perspective on, from my background in journalism as well as my time in the industry, and then kind of where I see media and communications going these days, given it's so much of how we get our information. And then I'll touch on some of the major issues that I see facing the industry, industry-landowner relations issues, and kind of give you my sense of where those are, and kind of the significance of groups like Synergy Alberta and how they go forward. So that's, and I think we're going to try to save 10, 15 minutes for questions at the end. So feel free if you have anything that I certainly would encourage you to ask those questions. And I'll give you a sense of kind of where we started. I think, let me see if this works. Yes, Gay covered a little bit of that, so I'll give you a sense of my career. And I've included some kind of either quotes or some things that I've kind of given a sense of where I fit in my career and how it's given me the perspective that I am. One of the things that I would tell you, kind of where the journalism world is these days, is just a little over a week ago, I had a call from someone in the communications world, a communications company, and they were pitching a story idea about a conference that was coming up. And it was there was 2 of us in the Herald's business department at that time. And this tells you how, I started there when I was in the 90s there would be 12 people. And she pitched this idea. This was the day after we had the fracking protests in New Brunswick with the police, and we had the derailment in Edmonton. Both those events, we had smoldering cars, and so I asked her basically, there's 2 of us, unless your event involves something beyond a fire, I don't think we're going to get there today. And I think that gives you a sense of where media is in this regards. There's been a massive change in the world that we live in, and it's not the same place that we've seen in the past, and it's dominated by fewer and fewer resources and stories that gain a lot of headlines trying to take precedence. So my perspective, and Gay touched on it a little bit, is I grew up in a very blue-collar family in the Maritimes in St. John, and ended up going to university in Toronto at Ryerson. I went, this was in the early 80s, in that post-Watergate era, and I think a lot of people of that generation got into journalism for the ideals of, it was a really interesting career. It was a great time to get into it. So that's when I got into it. I worked first for the Irving paper in New Brunswick, and then at Canadian Press in Toronto, which is a national wire service, and really focused on disciplined writing. And that was a great kind of learning experience in my career. I've covered, started out covering politics and sports. My writing, I think, still kind of covers some of that sense that I was a sports writer earlier in my career, and I think it's kind of given me a broad basis, having lived across the country and covered a number of different subjects. And I came into business sort of later on in my career, and did it for about 6 or 7 years before I kind of left the industry. The one thing that in returning to the industry and seeing it is that journalists are different. There's no doubt about it. I didn't realize that until I was I'd left the industry, and then coming back to it. It's a different type of person. They tend to be, it's a cliche, but they tend to be cynical a lot. They are opinionated on every subject. There's fewer and fewer of them, but it's a different personality that you don't often see. When I worked in the corporate world, there was no doubt that freedom of expression just isn't the same as it is in a newsroom. Now that I'm back in it, I find it, at times I don't always identify with all the other journalists, and they have opinions on everything. I'm a columnist, which is an incredible liberty. I write 3 times a week, and I get to have kind of state my opinion on subjects, and I write about 800 words, give or take 50 or 100, 3 times a week. So that's about how I approach it. I have colleagues like Deborah Yedlin and others who have opinions on almost everything. I have to do a lot of work to come up with these opinions. Snide comments and kind of backhanded compliments are fairly easy. Putting together a column with sort of some thought to it and trying to be balanced takes a little bit more work. So it's a fascinating career, interesting place to work in. I like to think of myself as someone who writes business for a non-business audience, and I think that appeals to people. Most of my perspective is from the time that I spent in industry, and I write for the people who are the average everyday people kind of that I ran into when I worked in the industry. So that's kind of where my perspective is. As Gay mentioned, I went to work at CAP, and from going from journalism, that's going straight to the dark side of the industry. It was a fascinating experience. I definitely, smartest group of people I worked with at any place, in any organization, as long as I was there during the Kyoto Protocol era in the early 2000s to 2006, and it was very intense time. 4 years was about enough for me. CAP is much more involved publicly. You see them these days. At that time, it was just making sure that that came through. We didn't have near the communications presence that they do at this point. As I said, I found it really a very interesting place to work. People have asked me since if it was, a lot of skullduggery or things like that, and no, it really is just relentless hard work and always focusing, dividing up issues, and relentless lobbying. And lobbying may not be the right word, but just making their case all the time. I really found it quite an interesting place to work. So that was while I was there. I was also at the time of the start of Synergy Alberta, 2005, 2006. Gary was brought on at that point. So I had when they asked me to speak, I had some history with Synergy Alberta, and I was really supportive of the concept and what you guys are trying to achieve, what has been achieved throughout the years. So I was, certainly I didn't have any kind of hesitation at coming to speak to you today, because I really do believe in the concept, and I'll get back to that. I ended up also working at Precision Drilling. I left CAP and went there. That was a fascinating thing, and this is something that may kind of you guys will feel this too. That's the real oil and gas industry. You're on the ground. I remember at the time going over training courses, and one of the things that resonated with me was the executive said that we care about safety, and the producers care about safety statistics. And that gets refuted a lot by producers, but I really do think there's an awful lot of truth to that the companies that are closer to the ground, that have the most people on the ground, have the biggest impact, and they feel that a bit more. So that's, I've always felt that those are kind of the companies that are the ones that you really need to touch base with on the ground. I also found out working there that it's about getting paid. For E&P companies, you get paid all the time. For service companies, it's a big deal. They make sure they get paid. That's the department that I worked in. I found that fascinating. I guess that's the fundamental part of business. I also learned a truth. Someone told me, you really need to watch in the oil patch. You know there's a downturn coming when there's no more donuts on Friday in the cafeteria. Sure enough, there was no donuts in the fall of 1 year, and about 5 weeks later, there was about 100 people laid off, and I was one of them. So that was my first experience with being laid off. So I've always, okay, if the donuts go, just know that that's a sign. So that was my perspective. I ended up working at Encana. It was a really good experience. I always thought that was a company that was a little too big at that point, so I wasn't surprised about the split. It was coming at that point. Interesting. Probably the most thing I got out of that, or kind of that experience, was they were developing Courtesy Matters at that point as a campaign, and I worked in one of the prairie divisions. And I really liked that campaign a lot. It brought it home to me what exactly were the real issues for so many people. If you're just a kid from the city, you don't really understand what a lot of these things, but dust, noise, gates, those things I really found really quite interesting. That's also where I learned that you notice that when oil and gas companies do community investment, they almost always put their names on places where people gather, community halls, arenas, and things like that. They do like to be associated with things where there are events where people are coming together, and that they're part of the facilitating of that. So I just one of those things that I found interesting, that there's a strategicness to what they're doing in all these things. It's not just being kind of good corporate citizens. They're doing it for a reason, and they like to have that part of it. In the split, I ended up going to Cenovus Energy. It's kind of a long-winded way of how I got there. There I learned that was interesting, that you can change the conversation about the oil and gas industry if you're prepared to spend an awful lot of money on advertising and communications. and it really has been quite effective for them. They've differentiated themselves in the market, but they have a commitment to communications like few companies I've ever seen. They don't even have any service stations or gas stations, and they have 6, 7 people in media relations, another 25, 30 in their broader communications department. So they really instill that. And if you want to change the conversation, if you want to have a different perspective, you can do it, but it takes an awful lot of work. It's kind of the big thing I took out of working from there. So that's how I got to this point in terms of my perspective in my return to journalism. That was 2 years ago, and I found it to be just a fascinating time to be in journalism. It is absolutely kind of an era of transition for communications, and I think we're part of a kind of a broader communications revolution that I would really say is as big as the Industrial Revolution, the Agrarian Revolution, any of those over time. I think we're seeing this now with what we've seen in the change of communications, and it's impacted everything in our lives. So I don't think, and especially a lot of the people in this room have seen that full sweep over the last half century of where we've come, and it really is quite remarkable. As with any revolution, there's going to be casualties, and I think we're seeing that with traditional newspapers. It's a changing world. I had this question. I was at an event last week, and they asked, how many people in the room have read a newspaper in the last 2 days, a physical newspaper? If you could put up your hands. Okay, this is a much larger number. This was at a youth forum on the oil and gas industry, and it was Jeff Lewis from the National Post asked, and 2 or 3 people put up their hands. These are all people under 30 years old. So it speaks to a demographic. His response was, that's disappointing. I think that's reality. I also think he missed the point a little bit because there's, and I'll get to this kind of where we are on modern formats and platforms that we use. So it's been 400 years of print as the dominant source of daily newspapers. That was going to come to an end at some point. Newspapers started with 1600. That era is now quickly coming to an end, and we're seeing how that plays out. When I was in corporate communications, and when I've come back to it, I've always made the point that the ideals of journalism are wonderful, but the realities are very difficult. And I think you can see that if you're a regular reader of newspapers, you can see where the quality has gone. You can see with the lack of oversight and editing over the last little while, and it's really quite fascinating. The changes there. There's just the ad revenue is falling off so quickly that they can't maintain the product. So you see things like newspapers canceling Monday editions every holiday now. If they look for an opportunity not to print, then they will do that. I think there was a recent occasion with the Globe and Mail just said, on Monday we have neither the readership nor the advertising revenue to justify publishing tomorrow. That's the truth of it. And it was a rare bit of honesty, and I think that's where we are. So it's just an interesting time. At the Herald at one point, we would have had 160 reporters in the newsroom. Now we have less than half that, reporters and editors. The pages, the layout of the newspapers now for the Calgary Herald, the Edmonton Journal, all these papers happens in Hamilton or in the Philippines. So that's why the headlines don't always match the stories, or there's issues with these things. So this is the modern world that we live in. When the news is done, it's shipped off to another location. That's the economics of how it has to work these days, but it's a transition, and you're seeing how that sort of plays itself out. So, what you're getting then, in my estimation, is kind of a divide in the media world. You're getting the move to the big national brands. You have the ability to read the Globe and Mail, the New York Times, the Washington Post, all those things. There's a high grading to those brands. The other side of it, and this is where the Herald fits in, and a lot of these papers, even traditionally big papers, is looking at a hyper-local market. So those are the two extremes. If you're looking to be involved with the media, if you're looking to get stories placed or to kind of do that, you need to focus in that regard. The big giant names are dominant on the internet and in other places. The local papers become hyper-local. It does make the small town papers more important, I think, to groups like Synergy groups across in your areas, because you can have a direct impact with those people. The bigger papers, they're just, they're changing their kind of focus on where they are. One thing through this is I don't think there's any less interest in information in the era that we're in. I don't think that's I don't believe that in any respect. I think you have more opportunities to see more sources than ever, and you have to take advantage of that. I will say, though, I do think the era of free internet news is quickly coming to an end. You see more and more paywalls. That was a period that it was like the 60s. It ain't coming back again. The issue probably right now is the television stations don't need to get revenue off of their internet sites, so CBC, CTV, the BBC can all really keep free news there. And I think for a lot of people, there are so many news sources, there's so much information, there's so much coming at you all the time. You can almost just be a pedestrian and get the news that blows past you, gives you enough information. And I think that's one of the reasons why we're seeing the drop-off in a lot of it. You can just glance by television, do all these type of things, and I think you get, a lot of that's good enough for you, or you can hear that, kind of what you need just in passing, and I think that's why you've seen the drop-off in media. I do believe also that if you look at the online, as I said, when there was a concern that was, oh, that's disappointing, people aren't reading the physical paper, that you are seeing a morphing to other platforms, and I contend that traditional media still does the bulk of the best work on the various different platforms that you're on now online. If you look at the major magazines, even things like National Geographic, Time, all these things, and the major newspapers, that's still where the best content is, and you have that available to you at all times. So I don't think we're going to see the end of those big giant brands. The value of them isn't what they used to be, but I think the death of the newspaper industry is premature. It's going to change. It's going to get bigger and smaller in terms of its focus, in my estimation, and we'll kind of see how that plays out over the next little while. But it's certainly an unsettled time, and you're going to lose names. I suspect that even with our own company, you could see fewer papers in Vancouver. You may get one paper in Calgary. There will be big changes, but I think you just have to, adapt to that world. And as journalists, we need to adapt as well to how that works out. As I kind of mentioned, the other big switch that we've seen then is in my career and returning back to journalism is kind of this return of kind of this rise of social media. And I think that's probably the biggest change that all of us have seen in the last decade in terms of how events are being played out. And it's funny, I just saw recently a comment that what we've really done in a lot of social media is move communication back to a medieval period where innuendo and rumor count as information far more than it had in the past. There's even this theory that we're in a post-truth world, that on these social media and a lot of media platforms, you can just say whatever you want, and if you keep saying it enough, your supporters will believe you regardless. And so you get a lot of misinformation. Recently I was at a conference, and they looked at the amount of social media hits, mentions for Keystone XL. There were 800,000 last year in social media, 650,000 this year. 80% of those mentions on social media were by the activist community, about 15% by government, and 5% by industry. So that whole spectrum of the communications world is entirely dominated by the activist community, generally on the environmental side, on something like Keystone XL. So it's just a complete change, but you need to realize that a lot of times you're speaking to your own audience in that regard. You're not speaking to other people. I think kind of the broader sense of a broader-based information system is more helpful. I also think that you've seen kind of social media develop in two different worlds. In the developing world, and a lot of places around the world, it certainly does change. The world changes. Insight's revolution has made a lot of different changes. In the West, I still believe that you can rally people around social media, but you need to move to traditional media if you're really going to have an impact to sway the broader public. I use the example of the TV show Dexter, just wrapped up recently. Huge internet phenomena for its fans. I didn't watch the show, so I don't really know, but you could see it on Twitter that it was this big television event. And in the end, and these aren't insignificant numbers, but 10 million people watched the show on television, and there were 1 million tweets. That's still 10 to 1 people watching it on traditional media than being involved in social media. And that was a massive event in that regard. So the two are coming together more and more, but as I say, I wouldn't rule out all the traditional media kind of just at the guise of kind of just under social media and Twitter. In some respects, I think these have, they've kind of turned into a news source for a lot of people, and you really need to be able to filter your way through them. So I've kind of found them in that regard to be quite valuable, but more as a news source more than as a social institution. And then the biggest thing that I've really seen from social media, and I think we would have, and in everything else, is just the complete lack of civility in the conversation. I think this speaks to some of the issues that you guys have been trying to address for over a decade, but it really has. You just need to watch reality television for an evening, and you see that the level of back and forth, the more extreme you can make anything in this day and age seems to be the way that you get attention. And I think we're playing into that just through social media, through a lot of these things. They are here, they're not going away, but I'm not sure that they're necessarily doing us kind of a great service in that regard. So we're going to have to adjust it. As I said, it's a changing period. Not everything is going to be good about it, but that's my sense. There's a lot of social media that's good, but there's an awful lot that is wrong about it. So I think I've gone too far here on one. The one thing I did want to tell you a little bit more about also in where we are in journalism these days is, so you're essentially looking at a 4-platform world that they're talking about. Print, online, tablet, and iPhone. These are where all the companies are trying to make their money. That's where they're getting their news to you. The biggest advertising is still in the print product, but all the growth is in the electronic side. So they're all trying to figure out how to monetize that, including my own company. And we'll see how that works out. While their audience is falling, though, newspapers and traditional media still have the clout that they reach the kind of the key stakeholders, people like yourself who tend to be more engaged, people in government, in industry. So they're losing a broader audience, but they still are effective in reaching those key stakeholders that you need to. So they do play an important role. But it's interesting. I know, and my company wouldn't want to know this, but if you're a rural audience now, you're just not that important to the newspapers anymore because they can't count you in their advertising revenues that they need. So it's just not as significant to you. You just saw the Globe and Mail editor come out a couple of weeks ago and say we're not interested in any reader who makes under $100,000 a year. It's not our audience, and which a lot of the reporters pointed out that was them. So we'll see, but you're seeing the media move to really narrow casting. They find out what their audience is, what works for them. They're not the be-all and end-all, the catch-all that they used to be. They're very specific in their goals, and I think if you're going to save the industry, that's what it's going to need to be. But it is quite a dramatic change. We'll see how it plays out. I just remember thinking when they laid out strategy for our paper, and the revenues just aren't there, and the debts are huge. And as I said, I used to be a sports reporter, and I remember Mike Tyson, the boxer, said, well, everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the face. And I think that's where the newspaper industry is. They've got a good plan, but the reality is just going to hit them so hard that it will be very difficult to overcome that. So that's kind of my sense of where the communications world and the journalism world is. The information that you get comes through those filters, and I think it's really quite interesting. I think when we get to, here we go. I think there's a quote from Peter Tertzakian, who works at ARC Financial. I think this really sums up where we are. This just came out last week when you see all these protests. Everybody wants all the benefits of life and the modern conveniences, and nobody wants any of the infrastructure. You guys have seen this face to face. And I think when we see things from the protests against the Line 9 reversal in Ontario, a lot of these things, you're just seeing that there's just, even if something's been in the ground or in place for a long time, at this point everything changes and there's just kind of no appetite. There's a lower public tolerance for any development. I think the industry has to get their head around that, that people are more informed, and there's a very much a sense that I get of what's in it for me, because you can pretty much be assured that industry is looking out for what's in it for them, and I think that's a sense that that has developed over the last little while, and I really do think that the industry has to get their head around that, and they need to do something. I've talked to some people about that, and the industry there's always been a poor public perception of the oil and gas industry, given the nature of what it does, where it operates, the type of work that it does. But personally, I mean, we had the kind of the telltale event of Exxon Valdez in the 80s. The BP Macondo spill in the Gulf of Mexico, I think, changed a lot again in terms of public perception and where we are, and not just on the companies, but the regulators as well. And I think we would have, so I think that everything up until then kind of has changed a little bit. There's much more awareness. We saw the spill with Enbridge in Michigan at Kalamazoo River. Again, big seminal events that sort of changed a lot of the public perception. From my perspective too, and I see where communities are coming from, and as at the bottom point there, it's that the communities can often, there's a feeling that you're being overwhelmed by a mini industrial complex that just arrives on your scene now with modern oil and gas development and kind of the way they approached it. And I think that really is one of the defining points. And maybe you guys would have much better sense of all of this, but when the industry arrives, they arrive en masse. It's large, the programs are big, and they feel like it's really dominating. As I said, I grew up in the Maritimes. The value of industry, of jobs, of an economic growth is really important. I'm in the 70s, so it's too easy to be dismissive of that, but when you're in a community and you see all this coming, maybe at times it's easier, I think, to take the economic benefits for granted and to focus on just the whole overwhelmingness of the industry. And so I think that I see that sense from communities and why they would feel that. You like the advantages, but in some sense of moderation or some sense of we have control here, I think might be helpful. So I want to kind of give you a little bit of sense of my kind of the issues, some of the big issues that I see and my perspective on them. The quote at the top is something I learned on both the journalism and communication side of it. People often see that they're out to get us, or they haven't done this for a certain reason, and often they're just maybe not good at their job, or it's just I don't know. I just don't always assume the worst. Just assume that people may not be good at what they're doing. Since I've returned to journalism, I may have written more on the kind of the three issues at the top here. Fracking, from my perspective, it's not going away. This is the holy grail for the industry in North America. They're going to have to figure out ways to do it effectively. There are real issues and there are perceived issues that kind of have limited, the potential for earthquakes I think is overstated in a lot of respects. The water issues I think are legitimate in terms of how much consumption if things are done right. I personally believe that if things are done right, if wellbore integrity in particular is done properly and things are done, that it is a safe way to do, or it can be conducted safely. We'll see. I know that they're moving forward in that regard, and there's an awful lot of angst. I'm not sure it's going to be accepted, even if it is proven to be a safe practice, but I'm not sure how it's going away, because this is how you develop oil and gas. I saw a poll in the U.S. just last week said that vast support for natural gas, but no support for fracking. So how you're going to put off those two, I don't know. Pipelines, another issue very familiar to every one of these groups, concern about aging infrastructure, what that's going to mean and where the safety is. My big contention here, and this applies to rail too, is that industry needs to be careful with their safety statistics. If they're so overwhelmingly positive, they end up meaning nothing to people. There needs to be more improvement in the delivery of fuels from what is already a high level to an even higher level. That's just the way it is And this level, the level of understanding and acceptance is higher, or the level of understanding is higher, level of acceptance is lower. I think the rail, I think it's a very solid offset for the issues that we have with pipeline constraints, but it has shown in the last little while that every solution is incumbent with another set of problems, and we've seen those. My sense is that in rail, its best option might be on bitumen, where you don't have to looking at diluting it. There could be issues. I think dealing with things like the safety of rail tankers and where they're going is a major step for government in the near future. So I think that's something that, again, it's not going away. There needs to be improvement. Somehow I feel comfortable that the regulators and the Transportation Safety Board are looking at this seriously and making that point. The other one, and the last issue that's come up, and this came up just this week, again, another issue that's going to be familiar to anybody in this room, the increase in flaring in the last year, in particular, morphing in that trend of, because gas has become economic and it's part of the production for for oil and associated gas, is, I find that really disturbing. This is just purely an economic play. I realize there's issues of why this happens, but that to me should be unacceptable. The industry is asking for issues. They're asking for more regulation. They're asking for less public acceptance as if that type of thing moves up. When you see those photos at night of North America, and the Bakken looks like Chicago because of the gas that they're flaring, it's crazy. I mean, if you go back to where the regulator started in Alberta in the 1930s, it was to deal with this exact issue of flaring off the resource so that you could produce something else. It was a ridiculous idea in the 1920s and 30s. It's a ridiculous idea today, and yet we really haven't got beyond that. So, as a journalist, that is one of these ones that steps out. And even Willow spoke to it. These things of local pollutants and local air pollutants are a big issue. We talk a lot about greenhouse gas emissions, and they're significant on a broad perspective, but dealing with the local issues, to me, is significant. And things like that, when I saw those numbers out, and I knew it was going in that direction, but to see the big increase in the last year, I know the ERCB, or the AER, is working towards that with industry to change those regulations, but it certainly was disappointing to see that. So. Let me switch one. I think that this comment from Andrew Leach, he's a professor at the University of Alberta, I really do think speaks to where we are in this day and age. And there is more power for landowner groups, for people to work. You can make yourself part of the process by knowing more about what's going on, and I really do think that's important. But in that broader sense of communications, and I raised this, there was a few issues that, and I think you guys may have dealt with some of these. When I first got into the industry, one of the things that really bothered me and the producer community was they talked about the regulatory approval system as if approval was a given, not the regulatory review system. That bothered me. The latest one we've seen come up is this social license to operate. I know it's a term that has been used in the industry for quite some time. It has some resonance, but it's become so co-opted these days that it means almost nothing. Ian Anderson at Kinder Morgan spoke last week at a conference and just said that the phrase means that, I don't know what a social license to operate is. I don't know where you apply for that license. But what we need is public approval of it was alliterative, public permission to do our job. That's what we really need. Social license to operate becomes this catch-all phrase that means anything to anybody. The other one that has been jumping out at me is this industry that we've been fracking since the 1950s. Yes and no. Yes, you have, but that's like saying there was televisions in the 1950s and there's televisions today. They're not the same thing at all. There's 200-inch flat screen high definition television versus something you had in the 1950s. That's essentially what you're dealing with. The limitations and what they're achieving in the 1950s or what they're trying to do in the 1950s is night and day from what we're seeing here. So yes, there has been a long experience, but don't hang your hat on something like that. And if you really want to go back, the changes that have developed over the last decade on multi-stage and the levels and the scope are completely different. So I don't think you're helping yourself when you just hang on that we've been doing this for a long time. Well, not yes and no. The other one, and I think it's the last one that kind of has come up, is energy literacy. I think it's an important concept, but I worry that it also could get corrupted as well. I do think we absolutely need a better understanding of where energy fits in our lives. I'm dismayed across the spectrum from working at both in the industry and now in journalism at how little people understand about the role energy plays in their lives, how important it is, where it comes from, what it means. But I do worry that, especially from the industry side, the energy literacy becomes, if you only thought like us, you would see, why we're doing this, and then it would be okay. I think that's a very dangerous concept, like social license. That energy literacy is fine if you just think the way we do. You'd see why we're doing this. I think is a much more different conversation entirely. So. That's my assessment of kind of where the big issues are, and I certainly would be open to take questions from if anyone has anything at this point in terms of media or the kind of industry issues. The points I think I would make is that we are certainly in a changing world of communications. It impacts everything that all of us do, and you see it in your world in terms of how you communicate, how your opponents, if you have, how they can communicate. Completely, it's a different world. The one thing I would say is that be authentic in your communications and what you want, especially in groups like this, industry in particular. Be honest and upfront about what it is you want to achieve here, and making sure that the community is on board and you hear the legitimate concerns that they have. I also do think in this day and age, and this speaks back to the civility issue, and you'll also see people in industry will read they get their information strictly from clipping services, so everything in the industry seems disproportionately important compared to the broad sweep of news and information that you could have. So read more, seek out more information, and be prepared to change your point of view or your opinion on things, I think is kind of the big thing that I would, in this kind of era of communication. And finally, and probably the most important thing is, it takes a long time to make change. It takes a long time you will have failings and you'll have successes, but I really do believe, having been on the industry and on this side, continuing the conversation, being part of it, you will make more progress. And I think that it's a very difficult concept to speak on behalf of communities. It gets iffy, but the fact that you have groups that are involved with industry, they're involved with government, and they're working towards a similar end, ultimately I think is highly beneficial for everybody. It won't always be perfect, but I do think that you get far more successes that way. In fact, the option is you just get a lot of people yelling at each other, and I think we've seen how that plays out.
You want to just grab a seat, and
Sure.
we'll start the question period.